Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to episode 73 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Back with our final installment of our trauma trilogy with the esteemed Dr. Jerrod Brown of Concordia University in St. Paul. Jerrod Brown, PhD, is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jerrod is currently an assistant professor, program director, and lead developer for the Master of Arts degree in Human Services with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health and a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. In addition to the experience mentioned above, Jerrod has provided consultation services to a number of caregivers, professionals, and organizations pertaining to topics related to autism spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, confabulation, suggestibility, trauma and other life adversities, traumatic brain injury, and youth fire setting. Jerrod has also conducted numerous trainings for professional and student audiences. He is the founder and CEO of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, also known as AFIS, and editor-in-chief of Forensic Scholars Today. Dr. Brown, of course, is no stranger to the show. He has appeared with us before in episode 64, giving us an overview of trauma. And then we kicked off this three-part series with Jerrod in episode 69 when we chatted ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And Dr. Brown was with us last week talking about trauma-informed care. Here today to wrap up the trilogy and talk to us about self-care strategies for the helping professional. We are thrilled, as always, to have him with us. Please welcome back to the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome back, Dr. Brown, for part 3 of our 3-part series on trauma-related topics. Part 1, we talked about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Part 2, we talked about trauma-informed care. And you are here today to round it out by talking all about providing some self-care strategies for the helping professional. So as we always do, although I assume our audience is getting to know you a little bit more, why don't you give us a little brief background, and then, we'll look at this topic.
You bet, Joe. Thank you so much for having me back. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for the podcast. So my name is Jerrod. I am a professor, trainer, consultant, and researcher. I do a lot of work in the area of topics that intersect with trauma and the criminal justice, forensic behavioral health world. I'm a professor at Concordia University in St. Paul, where I'm the program director for the Master of Arts in Human Services degree with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health, and also a second emphasis area in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. So we'll be digging into a few of the topics today that we cover in the program at Concordia about self-care and trauma.
Yeah, thanks, Jerrod. So before we go down too many rabbit holes, maybe just broadly speaking, can you share with our listeners How does trauma impact health?
Yeah, you bet. If you have not tuned in to the other two podcasts I've done, I think I'll talk briefly about what is trauma. So we need to know trauma can come from many different sources, directly or indirectly. It can come from a single incident type of trauma, like a one-time car accident, or it could be more of a repetitive types of trauma, which you want to definitely be familiar with the research literature that talks about complex and developmental trauma. Some examples of complex and developmental trauma might be like ongoing neglect, child abuse, where that child's in an environment where they're exposed to violence and maltreatment on a day-to-day basis over a long period of time. Regardless if it's a single incident type of trauma or if it's complex, it can impact people on many levels, depending on a host of factors. And it's very important, too, to keep in mind that trauma can be transmitted epigenetically, too. We won't have time to dig into the weeds with that today, but I know we're going to be doing a number of other talks on trauma coming up, so we can get deeper into that. When we talk about epigenetics, just be aware of how that can be passed down genetically. Be aware of the terms like historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, but trauma can be transmitted environmentally too, behaviorally. We need to take into account not just what happens postnatally after that child's born, but what happens in utero too. Was that child exposed to drugs, alcohol? Was the mother pregnant, going through extreme types of trauma? Was there any type of nutritional neglect going on? So there's a lot of factors to keep in mind. And again, most of the time when we think of like trauma, a lot of people think of child abuse and neglect, domestic violence. But I think if you work with anyone too, finding out about any history of being bullied and teased and rejected. Maybe it's looking at any histories of car accidents or injuries. If you're working with certain population groups too, really dig into any history of oppression or discrimination or racism. Maybe you work with clients with a long history of homelessness or poverty. And also looking at any exposure to community type of violence as well. So again, trauma can come in many shapes, sizes, and forms. And I think too, when we look at the criminal justice arena, very, very important to understand how trauma can impact the way in which your client takes in information, processes it, interacts with people around them, how they function in day-to-day life. It's very imperative to take that into account and really look through a trauma lens, because if a client has been to jail or prison, there's a high likelihood, never 100% of the time, but a very high likelihood that that person has a trauma history. In a lot of cases, it's not just a one-time type of trauma. It's been multiple events and traumas. One other thing, Joe, I don't want to take up too much time with talking about trauma, but I've heard of cases like this. I've consulted on cases, but we can't forget about like pet trauma too. That's an area I think worth digging into maybe for a future podcast series. But I've known some clients who've experienced pet trauma, a loss of a pet abandonment. Maybe a child grew up in a home where there was high conflict divorce. Maybe there's domestic violence in the home and that animal got hurt, injured, or killed in front of them too. So that's a whole nother layer to consider as well. Joe, any thoughts on that from your perspective, from kind of the corrections lens?
Well, you circled back to the criminal justice audience, Jerrod, and I'm glad you did, because as you were speaking and covering all those various indicators, if you will, I was sort of checking the boxes from my experience in criminal justice and specifically corrections, which again really speaks to how important it is for criminal justice practitioners to be trauma informed. I wanted to talk to you, Jerrod. We hear that term vicarious trauma quite a bit as of late. Maybe first define that for folks who hear that or read it in an email or hear about a training, but also talk about what are the signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue.
Yeah, you bet. And if you don't mind, I'd just share a few thoughts too about some of the additional consequences of trauma in general. And it doesn't matter if it's a client that's impacted or a professional. Trauma can impact us in many, many ways. It can impact us mentally, emotionally, behaviorally, physically. It has a significant impact on our overall sleep patterns. In some cases, it can contribute to a host of physical health issues. If you're working with young kids, it can really have a negative impact on child development, particularly if that trauma happened in utero or during critical times of development. So when we look at that through kind of like a child development lens, that can impact brain functioning, that can impact the way in which that child interacts and plays with other kids. Trauma can impact creativity. I have a good friend of mine who always says that trauma can rob your joy and really rob your creativity. So we need to be aware of that too. Maybe if you're running a group, a skills cogs group with a group of individuals and no one's ever taken into account trauma within that group, that could be a factor. That could be a barrier. That could be a limitation, because that can, again, impact the way in which that client processes information, makes decisions, problem solves. It can impact their memory, and the list goes on. When we start thinking about vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, I think it's imperative to consider what's going on right now in the era of COVID. We have to be aware of the stress-related symptoms that many of the helping professionals are experiencing. And there's so much research coming out right now related to the stress-related impact COVID has had on the helping professions. We're seeing increases in anger, irritability, lower frustration tolerance, mood regulation problems, increases in worry and fear and confusion, low energy. It can impact our motivation. As we start thinking about the practitioner and the professional, and if whatever field you're in, if you're working with people, we need to be on the lookout and really understand the topics of compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. Another line of research I would recommend taking a look at is secondary traumatic stress exposure. We need to be aware of isolation. We need to be aware of burnout. There's a whole line of research literature that talks about work-related trauma. So are you experiencing any trauma or emotional trauma? It doesn't have to be physical trauma within that workplace. Maybe it's a toxic work environment. Maybe you're working in an environment where there's a lot of accidents. Is there any workplace bullying going on? Does some people have a very difficult time having good boundaries, and they have a difficult time separating their work life from their personal life? Maybe some employees are dealing with a high level of shame or guilt, or maybe there's that feeling of just being on edge and you don't know if you're going to have that job tomorrow. So job insecurity. Are you in an environment where you feel like you have a lot of support from leadership and coworkers, or are you in an environment where there's limited support? All of these things can build up and up and up and can lead to a host of issues. And when we look at this through an organizational lens, I think it's also very important to recognize that these things can really impact that entire organization. And there's something even called organizational fatigue. If that entire organization you work in is dealing with a lot of trauma and that organization is stressed and fatigued, there's a higher likelihood that that organization will see higher turnover, more workplace conflict, people not getting their job done on time, higher levels of absenteeism, people calling into sick, just showing up late more, calling in, they're sick. Maybe that organization now is lacking a vision for the future. Maybe people have a lower level of resilience. So it's so important to address this at an organization level as well as an individual level. So if you're not familiar with the term vicarious trauma, think of that as like more of occupational stress. It's professional challenges. It's very common among the helping professions. And in this era of COVID, these issues are even more amplified. So professionals who work with clients with trauma histories and they hear those stories day in and day out, if you are working as a law enforcement officer and you're responding to traumatic events day in and day out, we need to be aware of this because it can have a cumulative impact. It kind of just grows and grows and grows. Be aware of experiencing increases in emotional pain. When you hear stories from clients that involve pain and fear and worry and trauma, those can really impact the professional as well. When we think of compassion fatigue too, we really want to be on the lookout for that topic. It's so, so important. If you're a professional, you're experiencing all of this stress, all of this worry, and you're not engaging in proper self-care, really want to be on the lookout for compassion fatigue. What is that? What are some signs and symptoms you might want to be on the lookout for? Do you have like a compulsion to work long hours all the time where you have a very difficult time separating from work? Are you noticing an increase in anger and irritability and your motivation has just tanked recently? Have you noticed some appetite changes? Maybe you are now overeating and you've put on 10 pounds in the last month. You're starting to engage in stress eating where you're eating a lot of high-carb foods, fast food, things that are not good for you. Are you starting to feel more physical complaints, headaches, body pain, digestive health discomforts, just joint pain? Are you starting to experience more depression? Have people around you who know you well said you just really changed recently? You seem more withdrawn. You seem more irritable. You just seem tired all the time too. Maybe you sleep all night. You feel like you slept a full 8-9 hours, but you wake up exhausted. Are you starting to criticize other people more often or even criticize yourself? Is it impacting your self-confidence? Are you one to show up on time to work, but now you're starting to deal with more of these issues and you notice you're having a real hard time making appointments on time? You're double booking. In some cases, maybe you're starting to experience more emotional numbness. So those are just a few things to be on the lookout for.
I love speaking with you, Jerrod. It's as if I could just ask Google a question and get my Wikipedia responses here. Your level of knowledge is impressive. Great job reminding us about trauma and also now these topics, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, which I'm sure many of our listeners recognized and or could relate to. So now, what are some basic self-care strategies for professionals? Something they should consider to improve and support overall health and wellness.
My own opinion, get your sleep under control and build from there. If you're not sleeping well, address that. Find ways to sleep better, find ways to manage your fatigue, find ways to create more balance. Very, very important to eat well. Maybe it is consulting with a nutritionist, a dietitian, a functional medicine specialist. Really look at your diet. Are you eating nutritious foods? Are you one where you are just working so hard and so long, you skip meals? That is not a good thing. Meal skipping can dysregulate blood sugar levels. One of the best things we can do to support our mental health is regulating our blood sugar levels. So snacking through the day, and I'm not talking about snacking on unhealthy foods, snacking on nutritious, protein-dense foods, lots of vegetables, of course, some fruits, making sure you're staying hydrated too. Not staying hydrated with caffeinated products, but staying hydrated with water. Are you engaging in exercise? There's some research to point to the fact that if you engage in exercise in the morning and get on a routine and get outside and get natural sunlight and fresh air, that can help regulate your circadian rhythms. And your circadian rhythms are very, very important. And that's kind of our sleep-wake cycle. Are you socializing with people who are very negative? Or are you socializing with people who are very positive? Obviously, self-care, try to form a friendship network, being around people who are encouraging and positive. Are you flexible? If you struggle with flexibility and shifting between things and you seem very rigid, work on that, address that. People who are more flexible and kind of going with the flow, that's a key and critical component to being resilient. And when we're resilient, we can bounce back from tough stuff a lot more effectively. I think, too, it's naming your emotions. It is okay to say, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling really down in the dumps. Maybe it's seeking counseling from a qualified healthcare professional. Taking care of your dental health. I don't think people realize how important that is for self-care. Going to your dentist, taking care of your teeth, getting outside. Maybe it's gardening. There's a whole line of research literature on therapeutic gardening. Some people like music. Anything you can do to calm the mind is so important. I'll talk briefly about this, but being aware of we want to regulate our parasympathetic nervous system. That's a good thing. When we are under a lot of stress, a lot of times we go into that fight or flight mode, especially people with trauma triggers. That activates our sympathetic nervous system. That's not a good thing for sleep. We want to regulate our parasympathetic nervous system. How do we do that? Deep breathing, relaxing, getting off the screen before bedtime. If I had it my way, I would be off the screen 2 hours before bed. I know that's not always realistic, but if you can get off the screen, disengage from anxiety-provoking news or media or whatever, create a calm, relaxing nighttime routine. Very, very helpful. There's some research too. If people journaling is very, very helpful. Looking at that, I think there's a lot of things you can do. And one of the best things people can do too that I don't think realize how important this is, manage and improve your digestive health functioning. There's such a huge connection between digestive health functioning and brain functioning. If you are a leader and you're working within an organization, do everything you can to promote and support employee health and well-being and resilience as well. Promoting breaks. Maybe it's self-care strategies and bringing someone in, a consultant, and providing some education to your team about the importance of sleep and nutrition and exercise. Promote compassion, promote gratitude, be thankful. Maybe it's mindfulness-based strategies. If your employees feel really burnt out and overworked, maybe it's reducing their cognitive load, giving some more time off if appropriate, having more breaks, doing some fun things together as well. In the next section, Joe, we can dig a lot deeper into employee health and organizational health. But any questions for me, Joe, on any of those topics you want me to go a little deeper into?
No questions. But obviously, folks could not see me during the interview nodding my head in agreement. But those things that you rattled off, I could relate to and or agree with. And what I really liked was just it's things that people could start doing now, cheaply, free, their own control. And just really be aware of those things, Jerrod. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think too, from an employee standpoint, from an organizational health standpoint, and I'm sure some of you are listening are managers, leaders, coaches, trainers. If you are working with people, if you're working with clients, if you're managing other people, this is so important too. Because again, as I alluded to earlier, organizations can be fatigued. They can experience trauma. And again, if an organization has experienced prolonged trauma and leadership and management have not been intentional with addressing that, that entire system can become stressed. They can become very reactive. They can become very change resistant, in some cases coercive or punitive. So we really want to be aware of that at an organizational kind of mindset. So I give trainings occasionally on like trauma-informed care, and occasionally I talk about trauma-informed leadership too. And I think that is such an important topic for us to be aware of, is for leaders to also become trauma-informed and health and wellness-informed. What might be some characteristics of a trauma-informed leader? If we look at the research literature, trauma-informed leaders are typically going to be more flexible and open-minded. They're going to engage in more empathetic listening. So there's going to be obviously elements of that with motivational interviewing. Trauma-informed leaders are going to be more transparent and compassionate. They're going to probably have more of an open door policy, so they're going to be more approachable. Trauma-informed leaders are typically going to have higher levels of emotional intelligence. They're going to be more patient. They're going to be able to use humor appropriately. And they're going to come off as very humble. Within the era of COVID-19, it is imperative that we as leaders understand these topics. And if we look at some of the literature that's coming out in the era of COVID-19 that talks about what might be some recommended leadership approaches to use to help support your staff's wellness and health, shared leadership is helpful. Providing strong roles and boundaries, communicating effectively. I think it's understanding some employees may feel comfortable coming back face-to-face. Some may not. Some may prefer doing telehealth remote work. Understanding, empathizing, validating, because these are difficult, confusing, and challenging times. And we really want to support the people we work with, because if our staff are burnt out, obviously that can lead to a host of issues. When we think of promoting resilience, there's a whole line of research literature as well I want to point you guys to. It's called health promoting leadership. If you just Google that, there's a whole line of research literature that talks about health promoting leadership practices. A lot of this research literature came out well before COVID, but it's clear that instilling and having kind of a health promoting leadership mindset can absolutely be a good thing for that organization. So what might be some health promoting leadership practices? Again, a lot of this overlaps with trauma-informed leadership, but again, having a high degree of emotional intelligence, being kind and calm and patient and authentic and compassionate, serving others, sharing and distributing leadership kind of skills and traits to other people, becoming like a coach, a mentor, really engaging in active listening skills. Those are just some basic things to think about when we look at health promoting leadership. There's another style of leadership too that's called adaptive leadership. And this is something that is very relevant to what we're talking about today. Leaders who are more adaptive are typically going to be more flexible. They're going to be able to respond more effectively to crisis. There's another line of research literature that's called attachment-based leadership. I do a lot of work with attachment-based kind of approaches, but there's a whole line of literature that talks about attachment-based leadership styles. We won't be able to dig into a lot of this today, but I just want to point you guys in the right direction. And one other leadership style I'll just talk about briefly today is transformational leadership. There's been countless studies published on transformational leadership, and there's actually some studies coming out right now in the era of COVID showing that if leaders engage in transformational leadership during this era of COVID-19, it can absolutely help lower the stress of the people they supervise. It can lower burnout. Many positive outcomes can happen. Joe, I can go deeper into any of those topics if you would like.
Well, let's do this, Jerrod. You referenced this earlier that you will be coming back, and we have teased this in previous episodes. We are going to be creating a new segment of the show for future episodes entitled Trauma Talk with Dr. Brown, in which, and in those instances, we're going to, again, take a small, intense look at some of these topics, sort of like the trauma corner, if you will. So why don't we save some of those for future Trauma Talk episodes, unless there's anything that you feel we need to address here today with the topic of self-care for the helping professional.
Just know that you're not alone. Many people are going through similar experiences. There are many people out there who can help. Lots of people understand these topics. There are resources out there. And Joe, feel free to share my email with folks if they're looking for some additional resources or readings on these topics from kind of more of an empirical-based standpoint. But I encourage all of you to take your knowledge to a deeper level and learn about these topics. Attend trainings, seek out advanced degrees, consult with other people, get more training on these, because it's going to help you regardless of what position you're in and what organization you work for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of advanced degrees, why don't we do a quick shout out for your both your master's program and your graduate certificate programs at Concordia University for folks looking to augment their human capital in the area of trauma and resiliency.
Yes, you bet. We've put together a really great program at Concordia, and we are gearing this toward the helping profession. And if you are already in your field of study and you really want to increase your knowledge on some of these topics, I recommend checking it out. If you are new to the field, that is okay as well. It's an online program. If you meet requirements, you've applied. If you have a computer, it's technically really open to anyone in the world with a computer. I think we're going to dig really deep into some of the topics that I spoke about today, but we are absolutely going to be covering topics related to the adverse childhood experiences research, complex developmental trauma. You'll become very familiar with the trauma and stressor-related disorders in the DSM-5. If you work with families, we are going to be focusing some of the education around how trauma impacts the entire family system. If you work with clients with neurodevelopmental, neurocognitive, or serious and persistent mental health issues, you're going to have a better idea of how trauma impacts those populations. We have an entire class dedicated to the criminal justice and forensic aspects of this topic. And there's an entire class dedicated to teaching the professional about self-care, resilience, wellness, many of the things we talked about today. So I do think it's a great program. I recommend checking it out. Reach out anytime. I'll be more than happy to answer any individual questions you may have.
Yeah, and as I've done in the past, I will leave your contact information, Jerrod, as well as a link for individuals looking at either the master's program or that graduate certificate program, which consists of 5 of those graduate level courses. Dr. Brown, thank you for wrapping up this 3-part series. And of course, you will be back for your semi-regular appearances for Trauma Talk with Dr. Brown. It's always a pleasure, Jerrod. I always learn so much from you.
Thank you, my friend. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Until next time.
A quick break from the show to give a shout out to our friends at APHIS, the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. APHIS is a professional organization dedicated to uniting the forensic communities of criminal justice, education, law, medicine, and psychology. APHIS is a leader in building relationships within the forensic community, locally and nationally. The mission of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies is to provide quality education, training, consultation, and research in the forensic studies to professionals and students. APHIS is a leader in connecting members with one another to help facilitate professional growth, increase competency, and awareness in forensic mental health studies. For details as to upcoming training events, webinars, or publications, please visit them at www.aiafs.com. And now, back to the show.
My thanks to Dr. Jerrod Brown once again. Although this does conclude our trauma trilogy, Jerrod will be back in future episodes for his Trauma Talk with Dr. Brown segment. Very excited about that. Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk, Trauma Talk. Hey, speaking of things I'm excited about, quick reminder, I am now brand ambassador for Make Time Count Today. Make Time Count Today is a United Kingdom-based social enterprise looking to grow in the United States. They have developed a platform that connects vulnerable people with local services that can help them. We believe our platform can have a massive impact for our service providers that are trying to support vulnerable people in the community. We can connect users with an ecosystem of support, including mentors and family members. We give them a shared calendar, a chat feature, and a service directory for self-referrals. For agencies using our platform, they can manage their users, manage their staff, and all interventions in one place. We enable easy referral from local authorities to multiple support agencies. Each intervention is tracked and 360-degree feedback provided. Lots more I could say about Make Time Count today. Please reach out for questions. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group, the Criminologist Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Are you socializing with people who are very negative? Or are you socializing with people who are very positive? Obviously, self-care, try to form a friendship network, being around people who are encouraging and positive.
And I feel so lost. And I feel so lost.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.